All right, so with all of this seawater around us, it would be really important to discuss seawater, the parameters behind it, and how organisms have to deal with it, and also talk about how it's spread throughout the environment, or spread throughout the Earth. The Earth is what, 3/4 water? We've been talking about 2/3 to 3/4 water. So, and most of that water is going to be tied up in the oceans. Look at that, 97% of the water on Earth is tied up in the ocean. Isn't that amazing? Thinking about all the lakes and the rivers and the streams and ponds and creeks and all them other things that are out there, and all regardless of that, and that makes what, 0.2%. Groundwater, of course, contains about 62 hundredths of the percent, which of course is important for us because that's where we get a lot of our water for consumption, obviously. Glaciers, another 2%. That poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Did you guys ever read that poem? Killed an albatross. And then, his ship gets crushed. Yep. He killed an albatross. An albatross is like a giant seagull. They have like 10 feet wingspans. And it's very bad luck to kill an albatross, according to maritime legend or lore, or whatever you want to say. So he kills an albatross, and as Marissa points out, his ship goes through all this bad luck. And at one point, he is without, the ship is sunk and without water, and he's, what it says, there's water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. He's out in the middle of the ocean, floating around on a raft, covered by the ocean being 98% of the Earth is ocean water, and you can't drink it. How come? Okay, but what about it being too salty would be a problem?
Well, if your body can't, salt actually makes you dehydrate.
How?
Well,
she knows how, because you learned in Bio 1, and we talked about in Bio 2. I bet you do. Now she's like, shit, I'm on the spot. Remember what happens? Water flows across the membrane, and I don't know if you remember if this happens, but if you had science classes, the way it basically works, hypertonic. The ocean is hypertonic, which basically means that if we were looking at a cellular membrane, and people online are not going to get this, but hey, I can. If I'm drawing a cell, and the cell has X amount of water, and our cells, and when I say I'm talking about living things, are somewhere in the vicinity of about 1% salt. Solutes, let's say. Let's just not call it salt, because I think sometimes when we think of salt, we think of just table salt. And what we're talking about in the ocean is a lot of the stuff that's in table salt, sodium chloride, but solutes are anything that's dissolved in a water, in an aqueous solution. So if our cells are about 1%, then they're about 99% water, aren't they? More or less, okay? On the outside, if we were to take one of our cells and we put it into a beaker of water, in which the beaker of water had the same amount of breakdown. So the beaker of water was 1% solute and 99% water. Now, how many of y'all have had Bio 1 and maybe Bio in high school? It's been a while ago, and you may not remember this specific concept, but the reason why I'm asking that is because you don't have to have had biology or even have biology recently to figure out how this is going to work. Water flows downhill, does it not? It always does. Water flows from where there's higher concentration of water to where there's a lower concentration. It's the same thing you may have learned about in diffusion, right? In diffusion is the idea that molecules will diffuse out into the environment and spread out because they're in a higher concentration where they start. So if I brought in something and set it on this desk, like that dead possum walking up to school this morning, if I set this right here on the desk right next to Lucky Old Chantel, who would smell the dead possum first? And who would smell it last? They would in the back, wouldn't she? That's because there's a concentration of dead possum molecules right here, and Mother Nature doesn't like things in a concentration. She likes them spread out. So those molecules would spread out throughout the room until eventually, if we left it long enough, the whole doggone room would smell like dead possum, right? Then the building, and then they would probably have a fit with me doing something like that. But you get the idea, right? That's how diffusion works. Water does diffuse as well. So if this is our cell, and this is a beaker, and our cell is immersed in that water, is the cell going to gain water or lose water in this kind of an environment? Don't make it more difficult than it needs to be. Neither, she says. How come?
Because it's equal.
It's equal. right? It's even. There's the same amount of water on the outside than there is on the inside. So there's no, it's like the teeter-totter's balance. You don't need to worry about that. All right, now, just to be technically correct, water is going to move across the membrane, but in equal amounts. For every milliliter of water that goes into the cell, a milliliter of water is going to come out. All right, so let's take your cell floating around in a raft. Take one of those cruise ships out and the thing sinks, you know, and you're in a lifeboat and they don't find you for a while. What's that one dude that, like 6 months or something, that he was out at sea? He got caught in a storm off the west coast of South America. They found him in Australia. He'd floated across it for, it was like 6 months or something like that. Guy survived, but he couldn't drink ocean water. He drank rainwater is basically what he did. But now let's imagine that we have a situation where you're in the ocean, and the ocean is about 3.5% solutes or salt. So then that would be, 96. Math was not my long suit, neither was arithmetic. So 96% water. All right, do the same thing for me. Which way is the water going to go now? Yeah, the water is going to leave the cell, right? Water is going to actually leave the cell because what it's trying to do is balance out the amount of water across the membrane of the cell. But in the end result, what happens to us with living cells is we lose water. We dehydrate, just like Marissa said. So drinking salt water is about 3.5% salty, okay, would make your bloodstream that salty. And the cells that your bloodstream supplies nutrients and water to would begin to dehydrate and dump water out into your bloodstream. Now, your kidneys try to take some of that water back. If you ever go on and you take like A&P, you'll find out the kidneys are one of the weirdest organs out there. Your kidneys filter everything out, good and bad. And then a little bit later on, before you actually get rid of that waste product, the kidneys take back what they want and need, like water and stuff like that. To me, it always reminds me of on garbage day, taking the entire houseload of stuff out to the curb, right? Everything, and then saying, well, wait a minute, I'm going to keep the bed. Okay, and I want to keep the fridge. I'm going to bring that in. It's kind of what your kidneys do. So your kidneys try to absorb that water that you're losing. But if you're drinking salt water, you're well beyond the capacity of your kidneys to do that. So you will dehydrate. Now, along the way, what else will happen is in dehydration is excess levels of salt will also cause neurological imbalances. So folks who reported, being out in conditions like this are dehydrated and usually delirious. And that's some of the dehydration, but some of it, of course, if they even try to drink salt water. And don't think you can drink just a little bit of salt water. Say, oh, just have a little bit. I need some water. Even a little bit. It's not going to quench your thirst. You're going to want to drink more, and then that's where you're going to start going down the downhill slide. So if you're ever out there, make sure you want rainwater. Okay? Or urine strained through a bucket of sand. And I ain't doing that. I ain't doing that. I know. Crap, I had a bucket of sand, I would have survived. But if I did, I don't know. If my dad brought home a book from Vietnam about the bugs you could eat. My dad was in Vietnam, and they gave him a book of, like, if you're in the jungle, these things you could eat. And that, if you were starving, like, eat this berry. For God's sakes, don't eat this one. And there were a lot of insects in there. And I was like, I'm pretty damn hungry to bug. Let me tell you. So look, see this big nasty beetle? It's a good source of protein. I'm not eating that. I'd have been a herbivore easily. Okay, so most of it's in the ocean. So this is a marine science class, and that's where we're going to spend most of our attention talking about. Very little in the air, actually. Only about 0.1% of the water on Earth is in the air. All right. Oops. Forget I got to click this button. When we talk about the salt that's in water, the solutes, we're discussing something called salinity. That's a term familiar to you folks, right? Saline solutions. If you wear contact lenses, you use a saline solution to store your contacts and clean them in. And we express them in parts per thousand. Now, I gave you percent, 3.5% solute, but in the ocean, we use, instead of percent, we use parts per thousand. So that's 35 parts per thousand. 35 parts per thousand equals 3.5%. Okay? Because we're dealing with parts per thousand. If we take off a zero from each one, we're in parts per hundred, which is what percentage is. So the ocean's about 3.5% salty. And what always has amazed me about it is very strong tasting. You know, if you're in the ocean water, it tastes like there's a lot of salt in the ocean water, doesn't it? Much more than 3.5%. But as you see, what is this, a kilogram of seawater? Only about 34, 35 grams, matching that percentage there, is actually salinity. It's actually components that aren't water. It doesn't take a whole lot of salt to give something that really saline, you know, characteristics to it. Now, among those other components, what's in there? Sodium and chloride. Sodium and chloride together make this compound, don't they? What is that compound? NaCl. Sodium chloride. It's table salt, right? So the salt that's in I get this question sometimes, is the salt in the ocean the same as the salt we use on our food? For the most part, because we're looking at what, 10% of the other components are sodium and about 20% are chlorine. So between sodium and chlorine, we're making up about 30% of the dissolved stuff that's in water. Things like sulfates. Water, the smokers that we've talked about, the hydrothermal vents. Remember how we all got excited about that last week? Because ecosystems that occur here that don't occur here, organisms that occur here, there's no place else on Earth but around that one hydrothermal vent. I'd love to be a scientist discovering something like that. You have discovered the only critter on Earth that's like that. That'd be neat. You don't get to name it after yourself, though, by the way. Doesn't that suck? You get to name it after something. You can't. I couldn't call blah 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 Clark Eye if I just. Now, if you guys discover something, I expect to be put on there, okay? Because I thought you're marine science, but you have to name it after somebody else. So a lot of the sulfates come from geothermal, hydrothermal events. Magnesium, calcium, potassium. Where do you think the magnesium and the calcium and the potassium come from? If this was a geology class, we might be talking about the components of rocks, and we would say rocks are made up of a lot of magnesium. Rocks also have a lot of potassium, have a lot of these other ions in there. A lot of this stuff down here is runoff. It comes from the water, you know, rain and rivers and so forth, draining that material into the ocean, which says a lot about we have to be very careful on land about what we put on land, right? Because it all ends up in the ocean. Things like fertilizers. Now, we think fertilizers are good things, right? Fertilizers make things grow, and they do. But when they get into the ocean or they get into lakes or streams like that, they make the wrong things grow. Fertilizer causes the bacteria and the algae to bloom. That's what we call an algae bloom. And that's good for the algae, and it's good for the bacteria. But algae and bacteria also need oxygen. So when their populations bloom, they start robbing the oxygen from the fish. And the fish begin dying off. And of course, the rest of the ecosystem begins dying off. And I was an ichthyology guy in college, and when fish die, that's got to be stopped. The hell with them algae. Now, algae are cool too. Not as cool as fish, but nonetheless, you know, those kinds of things are going to affect the ecosystem of these organisms. All right, so 35 parts per thousand, or about 3.5% salty. I keep hitting, so used to hitting that one particular button. Okay, table 5.1 in your book. Once again, there's the salinity I was talking about, and we write it as 35 parts per thousand. Once again, the sodium and the chlorine make up about 85%. Potassium, calcium, and magnesium trace elements, and then there's some minor stuff. There's carbon dioxide in water. Where's the carbon dioxide in water come from? Okay. Organisms that respire, right? Remember, if you took Bio 1, even if you didn't, respiration is a lot more than just breathing. Respiration is actually a set of chemical reactions that occur. We engage in respiration by inhaling oxygen. Fish engage in respiration, because they need oxygen too, by bringing it across their gills. They're able to absorb oxygen from the water across their gills. So the carbon dioxide is the other side of respiration. So a lot of the carbon dioxide is going to come from respiring organisms. Nitrogen, oxygen, some of the more minor ones, nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, and again, a lot of these are going to be coming off of runoff from the land, right? And I emphasize that a lot because, you know, these are the natural things that wash into the ocean, but there's lots of other things that wash off land and get into the ocean that we have to be concerned about. And then very trace elements, lithium, rubidium, and some of these other elements I've never even heard of. Lead. Is lead good for you? No, 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 no. So the natural is 0.03 parts per billion of lead. But then we hear sometimes about folks eating organisms and mercury, the same thing, eating organisms from the ocean that contain high levels of lead and mercury, even though there's only, trace amounts of these substances in the water. That's because a lot of organisms, what they do is they eat a lot of the smaller critters than they are. Like think about blue whales who eat the small little krill. And they may eat, I don't know, a couple 100,000 krill, if you will, and each one of those krill might have just a little bit of mercury in there, and that stuff gets actually magnified in their tissues, and it actually gets stored many times in their fat tissues. Years ago, they did a study on the levels of mercury found in the Alaskan natives, the Alaskan Indians, and these were folks who are actually allowed to hunt the bowhead whale. Whales in the United States, whales, dolphins, and porpoises are all protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which we'll talk a little bit later on. But there are some exceptions, for example, subsistence whaling, and these folks have lived their entire lives off of hunting bowhead whales. These are, native populations, and the federal government allows them to do that because one whale will feed an entire village. They're not out there killing hundreds of thousands of whales. But they found higher levels of mercury in these Alaskan native folks who were eating bowhead whales, even though mercury in folks is sometimes associated being near industrial complexes, because it's one of the major components that comes out of smeltering plants and other nasty things that we do like that. But all that mercury was getting up in the atmosphere, trickling down to the water, into the little fish, or into little critters. The fish would eat those little critters, then bigger fish would eat those fish, and eventually we work our way up to the bowhead whales, and they're magnifying. So if you only ate one krill there, blue whale, you'd be fine. But you don't eat just one. You eat thousands of them. So that was something very eye-opening to us when we first discovered that, holy cow, you don't have to live anywhere near these areas where this kind of pollution is being dumped out to be affected by it. You can be on the other side of the world in Alaska because this stuff gets concentrated in your food sources. Weird thing I read about mercury a while back during, was it the Victorian era? I'm not so good on those eras, but women would want to make their lips red with lipstick, and I guess lipstick wasn't around back then or available back then, and what they would use would be mercury. They'd rub mercury on their lips, and mercury would cause your lips to turn bright red. Of course, it was also, you're also ingesting heavy metals and suffer from heavy metals, but you look good.
It was also that thing they used to make their eyes clear. I think it was like nightshade flower or something.
Is that right? Poisonous.
They would put it in their eyes would be bigger, and it would kill it, kill it.
So their pupils would dilate, huh?
Yeah.
Because that's what nightshade will do. It'll dilate your pupils. Yeah. Nightshade is I was going to say a venomous plant. Yeah, it bites you when you walk by. No, it's a poisonous plant. It's toxic. Tomatoes are related to nightshade. As a matter of fact, you can eat the fruit of the tomato, but you can't eat the plant. The plant apparently is toxic, okay? All right. Pure water versus seawater. Well, let's see the difference between them. And I love doing this here in Florida because we all if I was doing this in Nebraska, most of them folks, they never even seen the ocean. But you guys have seen the ocean. So when I bring up these characteristics, you go, yeah, I understand what they're talking about. All right, how about the color? Pure water is clear, right? You can't see through it. It's got a very high transparency. Same for, in terms of seawater, I got to throw the caveat in there. It depends on the seawater. Okay, because I can tell you right now, as I was told you guys, I think, first or second lecture, different oceans in the world that I've been to have different colors to them. All right, so I don't know exactly how. I guess if you had a small quantity, all right, if you had a small quantity, then it might look clear. But now, if you have larger quantities, then you get the blue-green color. Pacific being very blue, and the Indian Ocean being much more green, and of course, it's the same for pure water. Pure water doesn't smell unless it comes out of our tap, right? And then, of course, out in the ocean, it has that great smell, right? Don't you just love the smell of a wharf? Oh, man, I just love that. To me, it feels so earthy. It just feels comfortable to me to be around stuff like that. We talked about it being salty. What's pH? Kind of in a very general. Yeah, it's the measurement of acidity, or what's the opposite of acidity? Alkalinity is how you, yeah, but yeah, bases and acids, right? Acids and bases. And not everything is an acid or a base. Some things have a neutral pH, and that means they're neither an acid nor a base. And the pure water has a neutral pH of about 7. That's not exactly right, but it's close enough for our things here. Things that have a pH less than 7 are going to be acids. Things with a pH greater than 7 are going to be bases. Things with 7 are considered neutral. So pure water is, according to them, neutral. The ocean is a little bit on the basic side, right? pH of 8. So we say that it's slightly alkaline. Alkaline is that term we use for being a base. Now, if you take my Bio 1 class, you learn about this neat little thing about, especially when you use the metric system, about the density of water. The density of pure water at 4 degrees Celsius. There's a reason why we're using 4 degrees Celsius. Water's greatest density is at 4 degrees Celsius, right? After 4 degrees Celsius, water becomes less dense. Greater than 4 degrees Celsius, water becomes less dense. Let's just think about that for a second. Put ice into a glass. What's it do? Yes, it melts, but it also what is? It floats. Is that weird to anybody? Why? It's weird to me. Why is it not weird to you? Sediment woman. Huh?
It's the same molecule, it's the same element, but I don't know, because the density should be the same because they're the same material. So they should kind of float in an equilibrium, but it rises to the top.
So it's less dense. But you said it was the same density.
It should be, but it isn't.
Oh.
Well,
That's true to some regard, what you're saying. Typically, things that are solid would sink in things that are liquid. So a rock in a pond, what's it do? And it's all about density, isn't it? The rock is more dense than the water. Well, water has these unique properties about it. Water is actually less dense when it's frozen at ice than when it's at 4 degrees, which is a liquid, right? Water does not turn solid until we reach 0 degrees, until we reach 30 degrees Fahrenheit. That's freezing. It's like always my wife, do we need to cover the plants? Well, it's going to get 34 tonight. So no, well, that's, no, won't they freeze? No, 32 things freeze, not 33, not 34. I'm not going to go out there and freeze my ass off and cover those plants because you don't understand basic chemistry, okay? So when water cools off from 4 degrees to 0 degrees, it actually gets less dense and it floats, which is good for us because that means that lakes don't freeze solid. Why is that good for us? Fish can survive, absolutely, and we can go ice skating. If lakes froze from the bottom up, then it would be a solid thing of ice. We might still be able to go ice skating, but everything down below would freeze, right? So the density of water is very, very weird that way. That's why we're using 4 degrees. But the density of water at 4 degrees is 1 gram per cubic centimeter. Now look at the density of seawater. So let me ask you that question we've been talking about. Would seawater sink or float in fresh water? I'll say probably. Why? Of course, it's 1.028 grams denser than the same amount. See, when we're dealing with density, we're dealing with the same volume. So water, pure water, is just a little bit less dense than seawater, and that means that seawater is going to sink in fresh water.
Wouldn't they technically just start missing and then it would just become liquid?
Well, yeah, they can, but not always. I mean, there are times, especially when rivers are flowing out to sea. Like, for example, the Amazon River you can go, I think it's about 100 miles out to sea in the Atlantic Ocean, and the water's still fresh on the surface. That's how much water comes out of the Amazon River. Eventually, that would mix together. But, I mean, in those places like that, you could actually get what we call stratification. Absolutely, yep. Freezing point, we all know. 0 degrees and boiling point, we all know. So seawater will freeze at a little cooler temperature. It'll boil at a little higher temperature. That's because of the solutes that are in it. Okay. A little bit of terms for you here. Where's this? That's a good guess. It's a lot closer to home than that. Indian River. That's the Indian River. Everybody been out to the Indian River and the Indian River Lagoon area on the east coast of Florida? No? Oh my goodness, I think I probably should live out there. I did a bunch of dolphin work out there a number of years ago, and then a friend of mine did some dolphin work, and I helped her with it. I spent many days out on the Indian, the Banana River. These are spoil islands because what they do is they dredge it out so it's deep enough for the bigger boats. So those are covered in birds and all kinds of bird poop as well. Now, the water in the Indian River, fresh or salty? Take a guess. Because is it fresh water with no salt, salinity, or does it have salinity? Chantel says she believes it's fresh. Why? Based on what? 50-50 guess?
Yeah.
Oh, what the hell? Right? It's a river. So the water that's in the Indian River comes from land. The water in the Indian River supplied from the land. So when water drains off of the land, it drains into rivers. Are rivers saltwater or freshwater? Or freshwater, okay? Now, it changes when that river gets near the ocean. When it gets near the ocean,